I am Lara Love Harden. I'm the author of The Many Lives of Mama Love, a memoir of lying, stealing, writing, and healing. I grew up in a family where there was a lot of addiction and alcoholism and chaos and violence, and no one talked about it. I didn't understand what was going on in my family, and I assumed everybody else had a normal family. My earliest escape was into books. Reading was my safe place. Books made sense to me and the real world didn't. There's clear motivations for why people do what they do in books. And so I read them. The first line of my book is reading was my first addiction, and I read them desperately. And reading is always a gateway drug to writing. So I eventually started writing as a kid, and that's where I made sense of the world and made sense of my internal life. And I thought whatever afflicted my family, I could escape it by educating myself. I left, straight from high school. I went 3,000 miles away, went to college, and then straight to graduate school to get an MFA in writing. And I thought that the addiction would never catch up to me, that I was out educating myself from that. But that wasn't the case. This was in the mid-90s, before the opiate crisis was a crisis, and I was prescribed prescription pain medicine, Vicodin particularly. And at the time, it was handed out in sample, like blister packs. All the doctors, the dentists, everyone gave it out as samples. I remember there being, I think it was at the dentist even, a Halloween candy bowl, but it was like little blister packs, like, try this, take one. And so the first time I took one for not physical pain, it was emotional pain. I was going through a hard time in my marriage. I had 3 boys in 4.5 years. Sometimes I think, did I have postpartum depression? Do I need to rewrite my villain origin story? I think about that sometimes. But I was depressed, and I never would have admitted that. My husband there's a lot of infidelity in our marriage. I knew it wasn't going to work out, and I had really desperately wanted to have the perfect family that I assumed everyone else had and that I didn't have growing up. And I was very committed to that. And so the first time I was in emotional pain, knowing that it was the end of my marriage, and I was at home. We were very poor, and I'm taking care of 3 little toddlers and a baby, or 2 toddlers and a baby. And I took a pill, and suddenly everything was okay. And it really wasn't. It was more like I could pretend everything was going to be fine when I knew it wasn't. And so it gave me energy. The way it affected my brain chemistry was I thought I was smarter, funnier, bolder, more connected to the world, optimistic, So I do think I was self-medicating, probably depression, but I never would have. Asking for help was not in my skill set or language or even a thing I would have thought of at the time. So that feeling that I got from 1 pill, then I took 2 pills to get that same feeling, and then 3, and then 4. And I was like, oh no, I have a problem. This is not a road I want to go down. This is I'm not going to be like my family. And I kept trying to stop. And when I would stop and quit for a period of time and be like, see, I don't have a problem. So I start up again, right? Not seeing that starting up again was the problem. And I used to have this mantra when I would stop, because it was kind of on and off for a decade. And I had this mantra when I would stop, and I would be like, choose life, because a part of me knew that taking those pills was not choosing life and choosing reality. It was very slow self-destruction, very inefficient self-destruction. And those, few pills that gave me that sense of well-being and okayness in the world, at the end of that prescription addiction, I was taking 60 a day, which is crazy to think about now. I mean, that would kill me. It would kill anyone today, but your tolerance level, and it took that many to have that same feeling. That's just what tolerance is in addiction, which people don't understand. I mean, even looking back now, I can't imagine it. And I remember at the time, when it's dusk outside and you're kind of walking through a neighborhood or riding your car and you see the lights on in the houses. And I remember I used to always look at other people and think, how are they happy? Or see people out riding their bikes, how can they do that? Are they not taking pills to be happy? I just felt very alienated from the rest of the world. And I think that's a common thing with addicts that I've known. This feeling that we don't fit in, that we don't belong, we're not comfortable in our own skin, and we need some kind of like chemical courage to interact with the world. And I needed to take the pills to look someone in the eye and have a conversation. And it's interesting because it made me feel deeply connected to people in a way I didn't without them, which is, you think it's the opposite, right? Like that you're disconnected. And then I thought I needed it to feel joy, and then you get this thing where you don't feel joy without it. And then, I wish I knew the moment when it takes over and it becomes like your very survival depends on it. Like you will die if you don't get it. That's what it's hard for people to understand, the compulsion. And this sort of every day is miserable because it becomes all about getting the drugs and doing whatever it takes to get the drugs. And nobody as a kid is like, dear diary, I hope someday I can be addicted to something. I hope someday I can go to jail. Like nobody has that wish for themselves or other people, but that's the road. So I had, I had a decade on and off, and then I, in 2002, stopped using for 6 years and became involved in the recovery community and ended up relapsing when my second husband relapsed and brought drugs into the house. And the pill addiction turned into smoking heroin. And from the time that I smoked heroin, and I had, 6 children in private school, I owned a business. We lived on a middle-class suburban cul-de-sac. It was 11 months from the time I smoked heroin for the first time to losing everything and completely imploding my life and my children's life, and not paying the mortgage, and the cars are getting repossessed, and not going to my business, and that's failing. And then I started stealing from my friends. My kids are in private school, and I would, take money out of my friends' purses or a credit card. And I knew right from wrong, and I knew this was not who I was. And so I did this weird, justification. Like, I'm not stealing from them, I'm stealing from the credit card company. And they have a lot of, just like the weird things we do to excuse, or I do. I don't know if other people do, but I was just like trying to mitigate the morality of it, right? And I think, that's hard. Like, I absolutely knew right from wrong, and I couldn't stop. I was just like, tomorrow I'll figure it out. I just need, today I need to have this drug so I don't die, and then I'll figure out how to stop tomorrow. And then it just went on. It's just this endless cycle. And, and I'd use the money, the credit card I sold to buy groceries. So even though I was using my money for drugs, you do this sort of like Jenga thing, morality Jenga or whatever it is. And so, just like crazy behavior. Like my world got really small. And I stopped showing up for, I think I told you, as addicts, we tell people these lies that we think are brilliant to cover up. It was like my secret, and I wouldn't tell anyone, and I certainly wouldn't have asked for help. And I remember thinking, I can't tell anyone and get help, because how could I possibly go to rehab for 30 days and be away from my 4 children, not knowing what was in store for me? So I'm not a criminal mastermind. And, I did use a credit card at a grocery store and then put in my own home phone number for the club card discount on a stolen credit card. So I was, my world, everything was closing in. And, I was taking mail from my neighbors. I used a checkbook from my neighbor. And on November 4th, Election Day 2008, the sheriff's deputies came to my cul-de-sac. The cul-de-sac filled up with sheriff's cars and deputies, and they pounded on the door, and they arrested me and my husband, who became my we were co-defendants charged with the same things. And I remember walking down the hallway hearing the police were in the house, and my youngest son, who was almost about to turn 4, was, watching a Wonder Pets cartoon with all the stuffed animals. He was the only one home. My other boys were at school. And I remember walking down the hallway and walking down the stairs and seeing the deputies at the bottom of the stairs. And A part of me was relieved that it was over. Like I wanted to stop and I couldn't. So it was a gift to be stopped. I think if I wasn't, I wouldn't be alive today, honestly. Um, but I had no idea what was ahead of me, what arrest would do, what incarceration would do, and how my life would change forever. So when the police came to arrest me, my youngest son was the only one home. And I asked them, please let me call someone. My other boys were at school. Please let me call someone to come get him. And they wouldn't let me do that. And they called Child Protective Services. And, I was in handcuffs. My hands were handcuffed behind my back. And, these two strangers in a black sedan drove up to pull my son out of the house. And, I think that was the moment where I realized I ran out of tomorrows to fix things, is that he was running to me crying because he was scared. And he was still emotional. He was at the age where stranger danger is the thing. He never spent a night away from me, And I remember, like, to go to sleep, you had to scratch his arm. And I was like, who's going to scratch his arm? Like, he's not going to be able to sleep. He still has me do that now, and he's 20. But he ran to me for comfort, and as a mom, my hands were handcuffed behind my back, and that inability to hug him, to lift him up, is when I realized it was over, and that this arrest, this, running out of tomorrows to fix things was irreparable. It was like this breaking point where I was like, I can't deny the reality of what I'm doing and what has happened and where we are. And it was, it's something I dreamt about and is still emotionally charged all these years later. So after I was arrested, I was going in the back of the police car, and I was arrested in a place where people don't get arrested. So all my neighbors were outside staring. The cul-de-sac was full of police cars. And I was so ashamed. And I was crying the whole way to the jail and asking where my son was. And the sheriff, who was driving the car and brought us into the jail, he took me in first, and in the little sort of no man's land between the outside and going in through the doors of the jail, he stopped and he grabbed my upper arm and, really tightly, and said, "You will never see your son again, and you should not be anyone's mother." And I believed him. I think that's a moment when this, shame, I already had shame, but this was like the moment where I just remember hanging my head and believing him and thinking he's right. And I love a good redemption story, but I thought that was reserved for people who are good. And in that moment I was like, I'm just bad, and I failed at life, and there will be no redemption story, and I don't deserve one. And it was my first time going to jail, so everything was unfamiliar, and from being strip searched to what you do and where you go, and just it was 2 a.m. when I was thrown into the jail with a mat. I didn't know where to sleep. I didn't know the rules. I didn't know anything. And it was a couple nights later where I knew all of my charges. They were saying they add up to, and at the time it was charged for things that weren't real, but I was told I was going to spend 37 years in prison, and I was like, I can't not walk out of here without, I can't not see my children until they're in their 40s. I couldn't fathom it, and I didn't feel like I had any strength or resilience in me to get through what that entailed. I had no spark at that time. And, and I'm detoxing cold turkey from opiates, which is not a pleasant thing in the best of circumstances, but in jail, it's really not pleasant. And there's no, at least where I was, there was no attempt to make that more palatable or comfortable. And so I'm not proud of it, but a couple nights after my arrest, I just said, I can't get through this, and I can't bear the thought of not knowing where my son is, if he's getting hurt, not seeing my children again, of the humiliation and the shame. And I was just like, I have failed at life. There is no do-over. There's no coming back from this. There is no future. There is no hope. And my children, I really believed at the time, would be better off having a mother who was not alive than a mother who was in prison. And so I decided to end my life, and I wrote a note to them saying I was sorry and that I loved them and I hoped addiction never got a hold of them. And I, put it under my pillow, and then I tied a sheet around my neck and like 6 strong knots, I hoped, and I just lied back and I was like, I'll wait till the guards come. I was on what's called the freeway, where it's open beds, and the guards came in and kind of made rounds every hour, and it's loud and women talking. So I was like, I'll wait till everyone's asleep. I'll wait till right after a guard check, and then I'm going to hang myself, and then I won't have to go through what's in front of me because I don't have it in me to go through what's in front of me. And miraculously, somehow, I ended up falling asleep and not waking up till the morning. And I didn't sleep through the night again for a month because that's one of the symptoms of detoxing from opiates. You just don't sleep. And they brought the chairs in for breakfast and lights come on, and I was like, oh, I didn't do it. And somehow I slept through the night, and I'm trying to undo these knots I've done really strong. I'm hiding under my bed. Like, no part of me thought to ask for help or like, oh, maybe I need to, I was embarrassed even that I'd failed at this too, right? And so I was like, okay, I'll try again. And the next, later that night, I'll just have to try again. And that morning I was called into emergency CPS court and told that, where information about my son, and that he was going to be able to go with his brothers to my ex-husband's house. And that was a huge relief. I knew he would be okay then. And it's hard to be being handed paperwork in CPS court when your hands are in handcuffs and trying to say, like, no, actually, I have been a great mom for all these years before this, even though I struggled with addiction, even though I had mental health issues. Like, I was still a great mom, and all of that gets erased when you're arrested. Everything you've achieved before arrest doesn't count. Didn't matter that I had a master's degree, didn't matter that I was on the school board or coached Little League or, volunteered at my son's school. It didn't matter that my children were like happy and healthy and felt loved and, weren't neglected. Like, all of that is gone. You become this worst thing you're accused of, this worst moment of your life. And, it was a really long road to get beyond that. I didn't try again to end my life, and luckily I was never in that dark a place again. When I had just a little bit of information, and I think if I'd had that information at my arrest, they just said, "Look, your son is going to be safe. We have a family we've reviewed. He's going to be here. Then we'll go to court." If I had any bit of information, I might not have been in that dark a place. So I didn't, and really the women that I was in jail with explained the system to me, explained CPS, explained the court system, what was going to happen, how it worked. They saved me. They made hot water bottles for me and tried to get me to eat when I was detox. They gave me the comfort that the system didn't want me to have. And people make a family wherever they are. You have anybody, group of people going through something together, whether it's a war or it's incarceration, you form a family structure. And they really saved me. And there was humor because we had very different backgrounds. And, I wasn't, the joke was I was representing the PTA gang. There was a lot of humor in that and a lot of, shared wisdom. I mean, my best friend in jail was 19 years old, and my oldest son was 17. The women in there were so young, and had been in and out of jail and had crazy stories and a lot of history of trauma. Most women in jail have histories of trauma and sexual assault and domestic violence, and they're in a system that, if you look at the red flags for domestic violence, they control where you go and who you talk to and disconnect you from outside family and what you eat and what you wear. Like, it is the system of jail that was built for men that women are in, and it is all of the hallmarks of domestic violence. So you have a group of women who are triggered every day by the system. So I ended up at my sentencing, which took some months to get to. I had a public defender, and she negotiated a plea deal, and if I pled guilty to 32 felonies, which I did, then the idea was that I would do a year in county jail, a year in drug court, have my record expunged. None of this really happened, but I did plead guilty to 32 felonies. And I remember her giving me the sheet, and I'm reading through these things. I was like, but I didn't steal something from someone's car at Costco. And I did, like, it was all the sort of unsolved things, and that I was going to have to pay back. You know, I had to pay back $19,000. I think the reality was more like that I stole $900, honestly. And, but I would have pled guilty to like 9,000 felonies to be able to see my children again. And I would have paid back millions if there was no choice for me. It was like not seeing my children, going to trial and potentially not seeing my children for all these years, or pleading guilty. Like I had my public defenders just recently say, we're sorry we didn't get it better. I was like, no, it was great. Like I really would have pled guilty. And the thing is, when you're in so much shame, like at no point was I like, wait, this isn't fair. I didn't know that I couldn't advocate for myself in shame, right? You can't do that. It's like you're just in survival mode. And you know, because my son was not yet 4 when he was taken, I only had a year to reunify with him. Or or some court was going to say I was no longer his mother. My other boys weren't part of that, but he was. And you know, for women, you can have one part of the county saying you have a year to reunify, and then the court saying you're going to serve 18 months in jail, which makes it impossible. So the idea that I had 1 year and I was going to get sentenced to 1 year, that was the only choice. So again, I would have pled guilty to 1 million felonies. You know, and so because this ticking clock started, and that's what drove me. And so, you know, eventually I was moved over to a minimum security facility in the county, which was easier to get through than the main jail. You know, and unlike prisons, you know, jails were meant for short-term stays, and so there's not visiting. Like in the main jail where I was, I couldn't visit with my children. They wouldn't let them go behind glass. It was only when I was over at the minimum security that I could see my children on a visit. So, yeah, it's not really conducive to reunification, you know, and 80% of women in jail are mothers of minor children. So, and a lot of women I was in there with had lost their children to the system. And so they sort of told me, you have to do this, this, and this, and deciphered the paperwork. And so, you know, luckily I started advocating, and we got a woman to come in, and we all had to do a positive parenting class, positive discipline parenting class as a requirement. But if you wait till the end of your sentence to do that, you couldn't. So we got this woman to agree to come in and teach the course and have it count for everybody, you know. And I remember technically those of us who weren't sentenced could still vote. And so I remember getting the county clerk to come in and register and vote, let us vote. And then she started saying, read this pamphlet to learn about the issues. And they were like, oh no, we're just going to vote who Lara told us to vote for. I was like, no, don't say that, you know. But it was just like slowly there's a little bit, you know, a little inch out of shame and a little bit more humanity, being treated humanely. We could advocate for more programs and ways to meet the requirements, you know. And there was a point in jail where I was like, I have to change my thinking. I have to think that everybody in the system is on my side. CPS, the courtrooms, and it was like a mental shift. So I'm going to assume that everyone is on my side and wants the best for me, whether it's true or not. And it often wasn't true, but doing that just helped me get through it more. And I think, you know, I'd call CPS and say, what else can we do to make this happen? So they started bringing Kane in for my supervised visits once a week. And the most amazing thing is, in order for CPS to bring my youngest son in to have a supervised visit, the other women had to agree to be locked down during that hour in the day, once a week, in order for me to get to reunify with my son in the time frame. And they did it. You know, and there's like amazing art. They drew portraits of him, you know, and I tried to make it as normal for him as possible. You know, like I squirrel away Fruit Loops and eggs and like games, and there was a garden there. This is at minimum security, and so I was planting things, and we'd work in the garden. Every visit, that he came, he would try to bring his bathing suit and leave it, or a pair of shoes, and he didn't understand. He was young, like why he couldn't live there with me. And having to like have that goodbye once a week was the most painful thing for me and him. But for me, I was like, I have to do this. But it was, it was horrible. It was just like over and over again, that sort of moment, but there was no other choice. I wouldn't have been able to get him back. And this idea that some system could say it wasn't his mother was just unfathomable to me. So the women really saved me. And that's why, when people say like people ask me like what freedom means to me. And freedom is it's a concept, right? It's a squishy word, and you don't really know what it means until you don't have it. And I think for me, freedom means responsibility, right? Because I got my freedom because of the women I was in jail with. And because they were willing to sacrifice, even more of their freedom for me to visit my son. So to me, with this book, it's just a huge responsibility, that I have for the women who are still there. So writing was really my first love and what I always wanted to do and went to school for. And when I was doing drugs, I stopped writing. And when I stopped doing drugs, when I was arrested, I started writing again. And I started ghostwriting in jail. I didn't know what ghostwriting was, but what I did was I would listen to the women's stories and write letters to the judge as them, because that was my skill. Everybody has skills there. Some people were chefs, some people could build furniture out of Tampax boxes, others were, draw portraits. Everybody has a lot. There was so much creativity and intelligence and skill and transferable skills, and imagination with the women I was locked up with, that people don't think about or know about. We have this sort of like, that's where the bad people are. That's where the other people are. And so we all trade our skills, right, and share them. And so my lane was writing, and so I started writing again as the women to the judges so they could get long-term treatment, for example, instead of prison time, or get a pass to go to a funeral or a graduation. And I was good at being other people, like it was a trauma response, but kind of a superpower, and it really like hones empathy, that ability to sort of, be in the mind of someone else. And so, and I wrote broke-up letters that seduced some people, that was my lane. And the thing about it that was so amazing was that I was doing good, and that felt good, but I felt like I had some value to add to the world. And so, and at a place when every identity you have in jail is stripped away. I was no longer a mother, an employee, a boss, a community member, anything. I was just my number. So it made me feel like I had some value in the world. And so I did that. I didn't know later I would become a ghostwriter, and that was my training ground for that. So and I started writing again personally. I started writing short stories and sort of getting back to the love of writing and the healing of it, because that's really how I made sense of the world for most of my life before addiction. So I was released August 17th, 2009. So I just had, I think, my 16-year anniversary, right? I gotta do the math. Yeah. And I was released. They had a new work release program, so I got released, and I was gonna go back to the jail and work out in the yard, for 8 hours a day. I had 3 different courts who needed me to check in with them and really cared about what I was doing. That's how I chose to view it. I was jobless, homeless, carless, friendless, childless. And I remember getting word that I was going to leave. It was like a Friday, and I was there, and an officer I'd become close to told me, and she said, I said, I don't, I'm never coming back here. And she's like, I've heard that so many times. I was like, no, I will never be back here. No offense to you, but I don't ever want to see you again. I did see her. She came to my book launch party, but and had me sign a book. And I didn't tell anyone because it's a precarious time when you're getting out. I just didn't, you're just scared something could happen, So I didn't tell anyone until it was right before I left. And I got out and I was handed paperwork and said, go to probation and check in, let them know. And so I went over there and they didn't have my paperwork. I didn't know what to do. You know, it was like the very first day was a lesson in a bureaucracy that was convoluted and illogical and unnecessarily punitive that would last to this day. 16 years later, it's still there. And I had no idea. I thought, I will get out. I paid my dues. I committed crimes. I should be punished. I believe in that, right? I did that. I'm going to follow all the rules of probation, and they'll be done. And I had no idea that I would never be done. I had no idea all of the ways in which I would have barriers to being done and barriers to rebuilding my life. Like, luckily, I had no idea, because I might have given up. I got asked questions like, how are you so resilient? I have no idea, right? I just know it's like I have to do the next thing in front of me. And it was step by step, head down, do the thing, get my son back, try to get a job, find a safe place to live. Like, it was just, this daily grind that, looking back, it was exhausting. And I have no idea how I did, except because I didn't know how hard it was going to be. I didn't know how long it would last. I really thought I would be done. I had no idea that every single sentence is a life sentence. From the moment you're arrested, it's with you forever. And, someone called the very first day I was out. Someone called and said I violated my probation. I got word I had to go to court the next morning. I was like, what? I'm on work release. Luckily, I was on work release at the jail in front of the cameras. It was someone, in my life, who I didn't name, who called and told probation I had been at my son's school, because I wasn't allowed to have unsupervised visits yet. Well, one, I didn't have a car. Two, I was working at the jail. And luckily, the judge on the case happened to drive by and see me working work release. But it was that moment where I was like, am I safer in jail? Like, there was so precarious, all the ways you can go back to jail with nothing to do with committing a crime or doing a drug again, which I never did. And how precarious it is, and how much people don't actually want you to rehabilitate, or want you to be punished for a long time. Like, I didn't understand that. And, and it was almost impossible to do everything. And that's having, I was a, middle-class, middle-aged white woman with a master's degree, and it was almost impossible to meet all the requirements to be in 3 different places at once. Right? Like, think about how hard it is to get a job with a criminal record, but then it's a job where, I had 3 different agencies in the same county needing me to drug test. They can't do one and coordinate. So I had to find a job where up to 3 times a day on no notice, I could just leave that job for a couple hours to go drug test. Like, that's almost impossible, Later on, like, there's things I never knew, like all the barriers to reentry. Like, I wanted to homeschool Caden when I got him back. And I couldn't do it because I had a criminal record. But I could write a book for Stanford professors. I was a Stanford professor, goes to write a book, but I couldn't homeschool. Like, just things that were just, as parents, we have logical consequences. Like, there were just so many illogical consequences. You can't get certain vocational certificates. You can't get, cash aid if you need help, for welfare. Like, just things like that I had no idea about, and jobs and rental markets and all of the things. So it was eye-opening to me. And that's apart from just the shame of it all. It's very isolating. I didn't volunteer my past to anyone. I lived in fear for 11 years that people would find out I had been incarcerated and convicted. And, I was trying to do good work in the world, and it's really lonely, because you can't really make real friends and have community, which is what heals shame. What heals everything is community. But if you're keeping your past a secret, it doesn't lend to very close interpersonal relationships, right? I remember being at Caden's first grade back to school night, and this mom came up to me and said, my son loves playing with Caden. Like, we want to set up a play date. Like, maybe I could bring my son over to your house. And I was living in a 400 square foot apartment, which I was very embarrassed about. And, but the main thing was, I was like, if you knew that I was once called the neighbor from hell on the front page of the paper, you probably wouldn't want your child to play with my child. And so, and I can't tell you that and it's going to affect who Caden can play with, and maybe you wouldn't even want me in your house to pick up Caden, you know. So it's a really hard thing to navigate. It took me, you know, over a decade before I could kind of get out of the shame and just sort of own the story and own my past. And that was only after I was, you know, building a resume of goodness, working at a literary agency and working with really, you know, good people. I was good adjacent, and I thought that would help me, you know, defend myself and my humanity later. So it was about 2 years post-gel, and I had been struggling, and I trying to find work and getting close, but then getting denied for background checks. And I saw a Craigslist ad for a part-time personal assistant at a literary agency. And the ad said that the literary agent represented Archbishop Desmond Tutu, which I thought was like, why would someone advertise on Craigslist? So I thought, you know, I was very suspicious of it. But the idea that I could go back to my childhood love of books and what my education is in is books and writing was like a dream come true. And so I answered all of the many questions, so many questions, you know, so many essays for a 5 to 10 hour personal assistant job. And I remember being at the welfare office because I was trying to appeal the decision not to give Caden and I welfare to help us pay rent and buy groceries. And it really felt like, do I feed my child or do I, you know, I got the call from the literary agency and said, we got your resume and can you be in an interview in an hour? And it was like this decision moment, like try to get food, try to get a job to get food, you know, like this thing. And so I was like, I got to, you know, I remember looking at Caden and it's like, I got to try. And so I scrambled. I had a car that did not go uphill because it was like a donated charity car. And it leaked oil and did not go uphill. And his house was like up a steep hill where the interview was. But I made it there, and I, you know, on paper, I was overqualified for the job. You know, I had a master's degree in writing. I had worked at publishers before, small press. I'd taught at creative writing at UC Irvine and English Comp. So he hired me. He didn't ask me about my background. He didn't, you know, and that's just privilege. That's not the first thing you assume about me, right? So luckily, I was given the chance to prove my work ethic, my creativity, my skills before he found out. And he found out because he, you know, we were working with an author who said, you know, people in Google their employees now that more than check references. And in his mind, he was like, oh, I didn't ever Googled my new employee. And luckily, the day before he Googled me, he had called me brilliant, right? And I remember driving home that day and thinking, like, how good it felt to be called brilliant. Like, to be judged not for anything mistake I'd made in the past or who I was, you know, in my active addiction. But he Googled me, and I remember the air in the office, just feeling the energy change, and I was typing away, and I looked up, and he was just staring at me, and his face was sheet white, and he had seen that front page newspaper article, because that's what popped up first. Now, if you Google me, you have to go back 5 pages. There's a lot of other good things first, you know, so it's still there, which is right. You know, it is, but I lived in fear of people Googling me for a long, long time. And he was just sheet white, and he was like, I just Googled you, and I didn't check your references, and I didn't know any of this. And the article was, I mean, it's still there, but it was not 100% accurate. But I was convicted of 32 felonies, so that was accurate, and that's scary on paper. It's scary to people. And I was in his home, and I was in charge of his finances, and his family was there. So I understood, and I felt horrible. And he said, let me call some references and talk to my family and come back tomorrow morning. You know, and I remember handing him the keys and all of his bank books and credit card things. And I left there, and I was like, I can't come back and face him. Like, this was my dream. Like, I felt so good, and it's over. And I can't, I was so mortified, and I was so embarrassed, and I was like, I can't come back. And, you know, I talked to some friends and that night, and I decided to go back, which I think was like the bravest thing I've ever done. And I remember in jail going, if I get through this, I'll never be afraid of anything again. Like, I remember just having that, because I used to live with a lot of fear. Addiction is all about fear, right? And so I decided to go back. I went back, and I said, you know, I'm sorry I put you in this position. and I had a don't ask, don't tell policy. If he'd asked me, do you have a criminal background, I would have told him. And I said, it's important to me that I didn't lie to you. And I'm just as brilliant today before as I was 2 days ago before you Googled me. And so he really, luckily, was someone who, he's like, I have to walk my talk. And it's hard for people. I think people believe in things conceptually. Like, we believe in second chances. We believe in rehabilitation. But where the rubber meets the road is, do we believe in it enough to hire it, to let that second chance live next door, to let that second chance in our house, in our communities, in our friend groups, in our play dates, in our book clubs, in our garden clubs, whatever it is. And it's hard for people. Like, I know, I never cared about incarcerated women until I became one. And so I understand it, but, I guarantee you in every one of those book clubs there's someone who's been arrested. And they don't, and people don't know who it is because people are too ashamed to share it, and that's so isolating, And there's people struggling with addiction. There's 48 million people struggling with addiction, and probably another 100 million minimum who love them and care for them and are affected by it. Yet there's so much stigma and shame. And, I think we need stories of people getting to the other side of that. And it's, humans are just human, right? So it's like, we want a redemption story, but don't redemption too hard. Don't redemption better than I'm doing. There's like a lot of, just human behavior things that is interesting. And it took a long time of me really trying to defend my humanity and prove I'm good. And luckily this literary agency, when he hired me, I went back, I never would have violated his trust because he was so trusting. And I think people, especially people who have lost everything, been devalued, been dehumanized, they always rise to the level that people believe in them. I know I did. I went above and beyond to never, ever violate his trust. I worked day and night, and it felt so good to be valued and to be valuable and to do good work in the world, And I spent a lot of time before this job. I was hired under a grant in the state of California that was subsidizing work, and my job was to get incarcerated women jobs placed in the community. And I could advocate for other people way before I could advocate for myself. But, my job was to go into business and tell you, why this incarcerated woman is going to be your best employee. And it was women who had minor children, right? And the number one reason women go back to jail is poverty. And so, you want someone who's not a criminal mastermind. You want someone who is going to so value being trusted that they're never going to let you down. You want someone who just wants to work hard and make money and survive and feed their family. There's all these reasons why. And all the women I placed in jobs did amazing work. All skill levels being the same. Why not hire the person who has already learned that crime doesn't pay, right? Who's already lost everything and appreciates what they have. I think it's super important. I think background checks, it depends. There's no room for context in a background check, right? A lot of times, especially now with AI, that's just, if you check a box, if you have a felony on your record, it's eliminated. You don't get the chance to tell your story. I mean, the whole criminal justice system doesn't have a lot of room for context. So I understand the need for risk assessment for businesses. If you have, if you have something where you've hurt a child, you probably shouldn't work with children, definitely, right? So I understand there's risk assessment, how risky is this for my business? What's the liability? But the way they're run is it's moral disqualification. It's based on morality, So I would love that we let people's past stay in the past. I got to ghostwrite a book for Archbishop Desmond Tutu called The Book of Forgiving, and what I learned from him is that he would never call, he's dealing with apartheid and reconciling nations, right? And he would never call anyone a monster. He would never call anyone irredeemable. He said to do that is to take away their humanity, right? And their ability to have redemption. So I think no one is the worst version of themselves that they've ever been, unless there's, certain mental things that are going on, brain chemistry things maybe, but, you know, yeah. So, I mean, honestly, I don't think I think that criminal record thing should be off the jobs because, you know, but we have this sort of thing in business where it's like, you know, even a business term, past performance indicates future success, but we're limiting people to the past, and no one, even someone who's never been convicted of crime, should be judged by the worst thing they've ever done or the worst version of themselves they've ever been. And so if the skill set matches, the skill levels are the same, like give people a chance, you know. And I think we're all just some questionable life choices away from having my experience or being that person disqualified, unable to rent a house or unable to get a job. You know, there's so much lost economic benefit with those disqualifications. And when we're doing it on morality, we're doing it on labels. That's a bad person. That's an addict. They'll always be that. That's, you know, a criminal. You know, we don't let people redefine themselves. And good, like, and I think people want to. Like, I do believe people are, like, fundamentally good. I'm very, like, Pollyanna about that. But it is just really hard to put it into practice, and I get it. So we have to find a way to make it easy for people. And context is everything. The story, you know, when you learn someone's story, then you're understanding the choices they made. It's not just a blanket label of, like, that's a bad person and that's a good person. Sometimes that's just a person who's been caught, a person who hasn't been caught, right? So, and there is this weird drive to, like, punish people forever. Like, if you're never done pain, I mean, that's crazy to think about. Like, and that same person who's like, yeah, we'll eliminate anyone. Like, what if you actually have 2 glasses of wine and you didn't eat that day and you drive home and get pulled over? Should you never work again? You know, it's always when it's personal, they're like, oh, no, of course not. That was just a mistake I made one time. You know, like, so it's really interesting. And I have a lot of compassion for humanity people being so people-y. But it's always when it's an other. It's when it's close to home, then you're like, oh, there's context and there's a story. And actually my child is so good, but this happened to them, or they, you know, and yeah. So, I mean, that's why I love, like, memoir as an art form, because you're in the consciousness of another person and you're making their choices with them, you know. And I always have big, all the books I've worked on, I have big, crazy, like, delusional goals behind them. Like, I co-authored a book, The Sun Does Shine, by Anthony Ray Hinton, who was an innocent man on Alabama's death row for 30 years. And he was only there because he was poor and black. And, you know, my goal for that book was, we're going to end the death penalty. 1 in 10 people are innocent on death row and put to death. And so if we had one out of every 10 airplanes was just crashing the ground, we would ground the airplanes, right, till we figured it out. And so not once in the book does it say end the death penalty, and no one book is ever going to do that. But the amount of people who read that and were in his mind and experiencing what he was experiencing, and then wrote to us saying, I don't believe in this anymore, and I never thought about that. And so I think, you know, narrative has the power to change the world, because it's all context. Everyone has a story. Everybody's doing the best they can do at any given moment. Even the people judging you are doing the best they know how to do, because it hasn't affected them personally yet. It's not their child, it's not their mother, it's not their sister or brother. And then when it is, their perspective shifts, right? And that's just human. It's like with anything. So, you know, I think in general, if you individually ask people one by one, everyone you meet, do you believe in second chances? Do you believe in redemption? They're like, oh, yes, of course. But it's putting it into action. That's where the work is. It took me 11 years to kind of own my story and own my past. For 11 years, you know, I was working on a lot of books with amazing people in the world, Archbishop Tutu, the Dalai Lama, Brian Stevenson, Jane Goodall. You know, our agency was representing all these people, and a lot of Stanford professors and neuroscientists, and I was doing all this good in the world and keeping my past a secret, and so afraid that people would find out and that my past would affect my work or affect the reputation of my boss or, you know, our agency. Like, I felt very responsible, and I was just in so much shame and judgment of myself. And it's a heavy thing to carry. You know, it affects everything. And I I had a friend, I decided at the end of 2019, I agreed to do a TEDx talk in Santa Cruz and tell a little bit of my story for 14 minutes or something. And I only did it because, the person running it came to my office and said, I'm not leaving till you say yes. And she was right. It was very good for me. It was pivotal. But it was terrifying to me when keeping a secret. And I had to really think about, like, maybe this isn't about me, And even when the book came out and I was doing my first events publicly, like when I'd get nervous, I'd be like, this actually isn't about me because I'm out, I'm free. And there's a lot of women who aren't. And so I got up there and I said, I was once called the neighbor from hell. And now I'm going to tell you about some other people I've been. And I talked about my work and my ghostwriting and the harm it does when we label people by the worst season of their lives, the worst version of themselves, criminal, junkie, addict, drunk, felon, like all of these things, and how much worse it is when we gossip and judge. Like, imagine if, because it really felt this way, was this, anytime anyone thought of me, they thought about that arrest or talked about me, that's what they talked about. I mean, no one was thinking and talking about me as much as I imagined they were, but in communities, it's like, we all love a good gossip, but it's so isolating for people. And it's so, maybe it makes people feel good. It's weird now. Like, I'm a cautionary tale to some people, like, don't do drugs, and this is what happens. And I'm an inspiration to people, too. And both things can be true, right? People read my book, and both things can be true. And that's a weird place to be in. But here's the thing. When I got up on that stage, and I owned my story, and I just told the truth, and I said the thing out loud that I was so afraid everyone would find out about me, the feeling I had from that was better than any drug I've ever taken. The feeling of lightness and freedom. There's no room for creativity if you're in shame, or if you're in survival mode, or if you're in fear of being found out. And so I was surprised at how good that felt, this thing I was so afraid of, and I wanted more of that. And I realized it could do some good. And the thing I was afraid of is people are going to know about my past and run, as far away from me as possible. And the opposite happened. People ran to me to tell me their deepest, darkest secrets. I have 2 years of messages of people's deepest, darkest secrets, and people are carrying a lot more than we know. And I'm like, I'm no therapist, but everybody's got something they're afraid someone's going to find out. Like, everyone's got their worst thing they've ever done they don't want people to know. And there's a spectrum. It might be like, I betrayed someone, I betrayed a friend, or I cheated on someone, or I cut someone off in traffic, or I was rude. Like, there's a whole spectrum of behavior like that, but that they don't want people to know about. And, like, shame heals in community. And I think if we are more forgiving of our humanness with each other, it makes the world a lot better place, right? So I realized in that moment, it was the end of 2019 when I gave that TEDx talk, I was like, oh, I can actually do some good. And so that's when I decided to do the book. I mean, I always wanted to write a book. Since I was a kid, I didn't think it would be this book, but it's a crazy story, like ordinary people have extraordinary stories, and that is kind of my jam. I love that. And it's a crazy, to go from like being charged with identity theft to then being paid to ghostwrite books, which is assuming someone's identity legally, it's just like, you can't make that up and have it be believable. And so I thought the book could do some good. And I wrote the book proposal, and when it sold, and you have 2 years, I said, I'm only going to do this, I'm going to be really honest. Like, not think about what people are going to think, not think about what my children are going to think. I'm going to tell the honest truth about. And I realized I didn't know how much I needed to tell the stories of when I was in jail, because when I got out, first of all, no one was asking me, what was it like for you? And I certainly would have told them because I was keeping a secret and I was just shut down. But it was really healing to tell those stories in a way I didn't realize. And so, I wrote the book in the first year, and then I said, well, I'm going to have a big microphone for a while when the book comes out, because Simon Schuster's going to, you go on book tour, you're talking to people and sharing the story, and it's going to be a big deal for a little bit. I didn't know Oprah would pick it and how big a deal it would become. I dreamed of that, but so I'm going to do some good with it. And so I co-founded a nonprofit. We started working on it a year. We launched it the month before the book came out, just to get people to care, because I was like, I don't want another justice-impacted women to waste 11 years in shame like I did in stigma. And the more we can normalize this, the more we can let people know it's not other people. It's your next door neighbor struggling. It's your friend struggling. It's your relatives struggling. A lot of people have been arrested and are hiding it. A lot of people are under carceral control and hiding it, right? That's your whole 1 in 3. And people don't know that because no one's talking about it. And I wanted people to feel that same freedom of owning their story and just telling the truth, because then you can go on to do other things, right? If you're just carrying these secrets, it's really hard to do anything creative or meaningful, I think. So it is called the Gemma Project, and it is Gender and Trauma Responsive Services for Justice Impacted Women. So it is 10-week programming while women are in custody. It's we're targeting the jails, the 3,116 jails in this country, which are the front door to mass incarceration, which predominantly women are held at longer, which are not as meant for long-term stays. They were built for men. They're run by men mostly, and women are struggling there. You're 3 times more likely to be sexually assaulted as incarcerated women than, walking in Central Park at midnight in New York City, and it's not by your fellow inmates. So it's a system that is re-triggering and traumatizing to a population that has almost 100% history of trauma. So it's programming in custody, and then it is support and services forever when you get out. And so we have trauma therapists. We've started doing some pretrial work in Oakland, California. So we're bringing us in the pretrial level, intervening before women are sentenced to try and keep women from going to jail. 80% again of women are mothers of minor children, often the sole caregivers. So if you care about foster children, you got to care about the incarcerated. But everything is so interrelated, and so we're trying to keep women from going to jail in the first place, and for families being separated. So yeah, it's really good. We're pivoting. Like, they asked us to be in the prison system, which we hadn't planned on, and so we're doing what we can, and we are creating model sites in California that we're not going to run across the country, but they're going to hopefully be replicated. So we're meeting with different, and it's hard because every state has different rules, every county has different rules and things. So it is a delusional goal, but I'm all about delusional goals. And I think the job is just to get people to care and realize, like, there's, my story could be your story. So the literary agency I was hired at, that I told you about with Doug, I stayed there for 12 years. So I was hired as a part-time personal assistant, 5 to 10 hours a week. And when I left 12 years later, I was CEO of there. And, we built something really amazing. And I decided in 2022 to start my own agency. One, I just have sort of an entrepreneurial spirit. And I wanted to really tell true stories, of ordinary people with extraordinary stories, like I said earlier. And really, again, I believe everybody has their lane, like your, attorneys are good to advocate, and I do books, and so I can change hearts and minds with stories. And so I really wanted to have total freedom to amplify the voices that I felt like I wanted to amplify, and tell the stories that I thought would change hearts and minds and make real change in the world. So so I started True Literary, and it's been amazing. And, I have great authors that I represent, and it's fun to bring more stories to the world. And I have authors who've been really generous to understand that, like, I wear many hats. I'm also an author, and so I had to, go on book tour. And I remember when I got the call that Oprah had picked my book, you sign an NDA that's like, this big. And I couldn't tell anyone, and it's the amount of content you have to create and stuff to do, and my authors are like, why are you not editing my thing? And I couldn't tell them why. I was so busy. And so luckily, I work with really amazing people who become very close friends. I'm sort of in their I'm in their business for life in every way. You're a therapist, all the things. So it's a very relational literary marriage when you're representing someone's life work to the world. So so they're all super supportive, and yeah, I'm very proud of the books I get to bring to the world. I am writing my first novel. You know, fiction writing is what my master's degree is in and what I actually think I'm good at. I never, ever in my life thought I would, write 14 nonfiction books. One is me, one co-authored, and 12 is other people. So I always like to have big, crazy goals. So I'm writing my first novel. I have a fiction agent. I'm a literary agent, with an agent, like a therapist needs a therapist. And unlike nonfiction books where you write the book after it sells, fiction you write first. So I'm working on that. I just, Caden, who who drove much of the book, he is in college now at UC San Diego. And he's going to see this and be like, why are you crying so much, Mom? No. But you know what? It was the moment, I've written 6 New York Times bestsellers. I've won all these awards. And it was really the moment when I took him to college. He got into UC San Diego with a 4.0 GPA. And I'm very proud of him, of course, but it was the first time, despite all of those sort of work accolades and accomplishments, I was going to park my car. My other boys were helping move him in the dorm. And I parked my car, and I was like, I felt like I exhaled for the first time from the moment he was taken. Because statistically, with 2 incarcerated parents, he's more likely to go to prison than UC San Diego. So I was like, we did it. All of those, head down, step by step, I feel like it finished there. And that was that was the first time I felt proud of myself. All of those things, you can read a bio, that sounds cool. But that was the moment I was like, okay, I did it. So yeah, so he's doing well, and I'm writing my first novel. I might try and write for film and TV, and I like to have big plans. I always have big goals that are delusional. I'm like, I need to run a marathon before I die, but I don't actually run. I just get 17 books about running. I read The Anatomy of the Foot rather than actually run, But yeah, so I'm just gonna keep creating. I mean, I've done a lot of book clubs in jails and in Chowchilla Prison, which is the largest women's prison. I've gone there 3 times. It is my favorite place to do book. My closest readers are in that prison, where they find one line and say, can you sign my book on next to this one line? And it is always about hope. And, hope sounds squishy and lofty and delusional also, but it's a radical act of rebellion in a place. And there's women who might not get out ever, who technically are on death row in there, right? My first book club there, I went with Oprah. We spent the day doing book club, and I didn't know how I was going to be received there. First of all, they didn't know I was coming. When Oprah picked my book, she disclosed publicly for the first time that she has been going to Chowchilla Prison for 2 years doing book club with the women. No publicity, no pictures, nobody knew except for her team. And so she announced it when we did our CBS News thing. And in that moment, I was like, oh, this is an issue she cares about for real. And so she had told the women in Chowchilla before the world that this was her book club pick. And I was like, how are you going to keep that a secret? But so we went in together to do book club. And my nonprofit had already planned to do book club there. The warden there let hardback books in for the first time. And Simon Schuster donated 800 books there. This is, before Oprah. We had already had we had matching plans, right? So you can't make that up. And it was the first time where the warden also had all the correctional officers read the book. It was going to be a prison-wide book club. And so Oprah was going back, and we coordinated, and I went with her, and the women didn't know that I was going to be there, and I didn't know how I was going to be received. Because in some ways, I'm snitching on a lot of things. Right? In some ways, people be like, why does she get all of this spotlight? I just didn't know how, I was worried. I had some anxiety. And so, Oprah walks in, and of course, everybody's, it's a big scene and big cheering, and there's about 150 incarcerated women in this cafeteria. And I'm kind of hanging in the back, and she kind of waves me up. And then she goes, Mama Love is here. which was my prison nickname in the name of my book. And the women all jumped up and started crying and screaming and clapping. And I was like, oh, Oprah, I got this. Like, I just took over. I didn't, like, no, But it was, like, the most thoughtful questions and the most, like, thing. Like, the women really felt seen. And the book club moms feel seen, too, right? And the people who have no experience this feel seen, because everyone knows what it's like to be ashamed of something. But the women were, like, so happy to be having their story told also. And really my closest readers, they had the greatest questions. I've gone back there a bunch of times and gone into jails. And, when I walked out of Blaine Street, where I was, and I said, I'm never coming back there again. I did go back this last summer to do book club there, to talk to the women. And it's amazing. It was like going back, when you go back to your high school and you're like, everything is so much smaller than I thought. So I'm back at Blaine Street where I spent so many mornings cooking for the women there and just wanting to be able to cook in my own home. And it taught me gratitude. Like, any time over the last 16 years, I was like, oh, I got to sweep the floor. I remember being in jail going, if only I could sweep my own floor and not this jail floor, But I went back and everything was so small, so much smaller than I remembered. And I met the woman who's sleeping in my room, and they're telling their stories. And, this thing I got from a book I read by Mark Nepo called The Book of Awakening was a sort of mantra that I used in the second half of my sentence that carried me through all these years. It was pain pushes until vision pulls. And I really, there was this moment in incarceration where I realized, like, I let pain push me. We all did for most of our lives. And, like, what if we have a vision for something different? What if the world has a vision for something different, and we let that pull us to the future? And so that is my mantra that I used, pain pushes until vision pulls. And when I was there, the people running Blaine Street now said, the women are like, we want to write that on the wall here. And so I haven't gone back to see if they did, but, and then just ironically, because real life is stranger than anything we can make up, last month I got asked to go teach in upstate New York at Omega Institute, a weekend writing retreat. And I'm there, and the director picked me up at the train station, and they dropped me off in front of the cafe because our cabins weren't ready, and I was going to teach, for 3 days. And they dropped me off right in front of Mark Nepo. He's sitting there.
Wow.
And he was teaching the same exact weekend. There's a bunch of retreats going on the same exact place 16 years after. 16 years ago, I was reading his book every day to get me through like a horoscope, The Book of Awakening. And he was there. And I get out of the golf cart and I see him, and he stands up and he goes, Lara, I loved your book. And I got to spend that whole weekend telling him how much his book changed my life and gave me hope. And so we become friends. So it's one of those synchronicities in life, like we're there as colleagues. 16 years ago, I was reading his book to save my life and to find hope. And now we're there as equals, teaching at the same place on the same weekend together. So it was amazing. I hope people who read my book understand that no one is the worst thing they've ever done. And how much community is what heals everything. When we isolate people because of their past, it helps nothing. And I hope women who are just as impacted own their stories and their truth and their past without shame a lot sooner than I did. There's a lot of power now to be like, yeah, I went to jail. That's part of my story. It is not the whole story. I think people just don't know. They don't even know what they don't know. I think understanding that this is not other people, this is not bad people or good people, that everyone in your community is affected by incarceration, by arrest, by carceral control, that it is not some faraway, distant idea. It is next door to you. It is in your community. It's in your schools. It's in, everyone. More people are just as impacted than we know, and more people are paying for a lot longer than they should ever have to. Like, people should pay for their crimes. That is our justice system, but we also have to let people pay for their crimes. That's the work, And I think people only care about things when when it hits them personally in their home. And if they don't know how personal it is, they need to know. So, yeah, I don't think stigma or shame help anything get better.